Welcome to Law Talk, brought to you by the Falvello Law Firm. Remember, you can get them at 570-788-4191 or their law at falvellolaw.com. Great show for you today. We're going to take you back in history. Can you believe 100 years? Falvello Law Firm, the Falvello family, have been involved in law for 100 years. I'm very happy to have on the show, of course, attorney Conrad Falvello has been on, but now we have Alexis Falvello. Alexis, nice to see you.
Good to see you.
Before we get to you, Connie, Alexis, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I graduated from Hazleton Area High School in '97, Dickinson College in 2002, and then Dickinson Law School in 2005. Then I practiced in Pittsburgh for a couple years, came back to the Hazleton area, was with my father for a couple years, and then I transitioned full-time into Luzerne County District Attorney's Office for approximately 7 years before returning then back to Falvello Law full-time. And I've been there since.
Okay, why did you decide to go into law?
The attraction there for me, I think, was being a prosecutor, actually, which is what I then became for 8 years in Luzerne County. I just really enjoyed sticking up for victims, which I continue to do actually in private practice, doing car accident cases. Generally speaking, initially you do pretty much everything. The smaller type cases, misdemeanor charges, misdemeanor offenses, things like that. But as in 2012, I was actually promoted to deputy district attorney, so I was third in charge in Luzerne County. And I did vehicular homicide cases, I did child abuse cases. Some of the cases that were more notable, there was a fatal hit and run involving a 5-year-old victim, and that occurred 4 days before Christmas. And that was a tough one to handle, but we fortunately were able to pull in an expert from Washington State who helped us identify the vehicle that led us then to the individual who was driving the vehicle, and then accountability when he was ultimately sentenced after he pled guilty to the charges of leaving the scene of an accident. I worked with the victim's family on that case to get the law changed in Pennsylvania to allow for fatal accidents where an individual leaves the scene results in a penalty of a mandatory sentence of 3 years minimum, because prior to that it was only 1 year that you'd be sentenced to, whereas if you were involved in a vehicular homicide and stayed at the scene, it was a mandated 3 years. So the law now has changed to be 3 to 6 years for a fatal hit and run, as well as vehicular homicide when you're staying at the scene.
Learning from the experiences you had in the DA's office, okay, is there much of a transition now that you're practicing, and thank God your practice is doing very well? Do you see any kind of a different change?
There's a lot of overlapping because, again, I primarily focus on car crashes. So there's a lot of involvement with law enforcement. Of course, it's a different perspective as a plaintiff's attorney, but you're always going after. The similarities would be you're going after the bad guy in the DA's office, and then perhaps the insurance company. Not necessarily that they're the bad guys, but you want to get justice for your client, and you do so through the insurance companies.
You find it exciting what you're doing?
I do. I mean, sometimes it's tough because you have people coming into your office under circumstances that they'd rather not be facing.
Yes.
Truly, but it's to validate what their experience is and what their injuries are, and holding responsible parties accountable. I mean, again, that parallels what I did in the DA's office. And I certainly do enjoy getting that accountability, particularly to validate the clients and perhaps send them along in a situation as best they could be moving forward.
This is a show that I think I'd be excited if I was a grandchild, and your dad and what they went through. So excited about what we're going to be talking about.
Yes, I think the history of the family certainly is one that's very special to me, and just our roots in the Hazleton area really do mean a lot to me personally, and I know, to my father also.
Let's get right to it. Connie, going back to, let's start this story. It's an interesting story, my friends, believe me. Whether you know the Falvellos or not, it's an interesting story. So let's start with 1910.
The story is really on two sides of the family. We'll talk about the Falvello side, my paternal side. My grandfather and his two brothers were three sons of five children. His name was Antonio Falvello. He was the youngest of 16 who immigrated here from the Anzi part of Italy. And when he came here, shortly after that, as I'm told, his wife passed away. And, back then in the late 1800s and moving into early 1900s, he had, his only skill was he was a stonemason. And he got a job working for the Wilkes-Barre-Hazleton Railroad as a stonemason building bridge abutments, but it wasn't enough to sustain a family of five children. So my grandfather and his two brothers and their two sisters started out in orphanages. My grandfather and his brother Rocco and his brother James were at St. Patrick's orphanage in Scranton at first. And then as they got older, they came to the United Charities home here in Hazleton, West Hazleton actually. And we had found a receipt from August of 1910, the United Charities home, $10 to board his three sons. And they stayed in the United Charities home until they went to college. All three of them actually bootstrapped themselves. My grandfather went to what was then called the Strasbourg Normal School, which is
Strasbourg Normal School.
Normal School, which is now Strasbourg, University of Strasbourg. It used to be Strasbourg State, now it's Strasbourg. And then his brother Rex did the same. Brother Jim, he was the youngest of the three boys. He went to Temple, where he played football, and then went on to Temple Dental School. But Conrad, my grandfather, and Rex, his brother, both went from college to Dickinson Law School. But it all started, for the Falvello part of the family, really at the United Charities here in Hazleton. That was where our roots started, and we've been here ever since.
So taking them, they went to college, they got to law degrees, okay? So then how then things proceed from there?
Conrad, my grandfather, graduated in 1923. We have a photo of my great-grandfather wearing his one and only suit at my grandfather's graduation from Dickinson Law in 1923. And then Rex followed from Dickinson Law in 1925, and they took up shop with their office in the Hazleton National Bank building. And they stayed there for, until they passed away. My Uncle Rex passed in 1961, and my grandfather in 1967. At that time, I was a senior in high school. And by then, of course, my dad was in practice. In 1935, my grandfather was appointed as a deputy United States District Attorney in Scranton. And he served in that capacity several years, and of course was also in Hazleton. But Rex and Conrad both spoke Italian. They learned Italian from their father, and of course, their clientele. They didn't represent big banks or trust funds or big corporations. They worked primarily for the immigrant population in Hazleton. A lot of it was the Italian immigrants who came here to work in the mines. And they came to them, meaning the people came to them because they could speak Italian. In fact, my grandfather and my Uncle Jim could recite a Catholic Mass in Latin as well. So they were very brilliant people, but they served the people that worked here in Hazleton. That was their pleasure, that was their practice. And I know that because until I was about 8 years old, I lived in the same household with my grandfather, Conrad. It was him and my grandmother, my father and mother, myself, and at the time up to the 4 of the 5 of my generation lived in the same household. And even though they spoke Italian, I learned a little bit when I was young, but my grandfather always told me, your great-grandfather, my great-grandfather, the stonemason, came here to be Americans. So they didn't push us to learn Italian or speak Italian. They said, you're going to be an American, and that's what we want for you. And that's how I began. That's how I began. So it's pretty amazing when you think about where they started, where Grazie Antonio, my great-grandfather, came here penniless and had to put his children in orphanages, worked for the railroad, and in this case, his 3 sons bootstrapped themselves up to be professionals. And all of them stayed here in Hazleton. My Uncle Jim, my great-uncle Jim, became a dentist, and his office was in the Capitol building on Broad Street, which was 2 doors up from the Hazleton National Bank building.
And if you want to see that office, you go to the museum in Hazleton, and they have
That's correct.
They have the office there, which is quite unique. Your grandfather, okay, Conrad, okay, how many children did he have?
Just one.
Oh, Tony.
This is my dad.
Your dad and his brother, Rex. How many children did he have?
Rex had 1, and Jim had 2 sons. All boys.
Did they all go into law?
Well, my father did. Rex's son did not. He is living now in Silver Spring, Maryland area, and he spent his career with Westinghouse. So he's very successful there. And Jim had 2 boys, Jim Jr. and John. Jim, he's passed. He was out of town. I think he was as well in Maryland. But John became a teacher here in Hazleton and taught his whole career. He was a gym teacher in Hazleton.
Yes, yeah. Very well known too.
John knew more people than I did because he had everybody in school, but he stayed here as well.
Friends, I'm talking to attorney Conrad Falvello and his lovely daughter Lexi Falvello. Great law firm, interesting stories, but we learn lessons, and boy, nothing like talking to people who've been around and survived. We'll be back right after this. Welcome back to Law Talk, brought to you by the Falvello Law Firm, my friends, 570-788-4191 or falvellolaw.com. And once again, thank you for participating in our scientific survey by Susquehanna Polling and Research, the #1 polling company in the state of Pennsylvania. 100 years. 100 years, the Falvello Law Firm's been around, and I'm talking to attorney Conrad Falvello and Lexi Falvello. Lexi, I could tell you many stories about my grandparents, my grandfather. He had a doctor's degree in common sense, all right, and which I don't think exist anymore.
I was going to say they're very rare today.
Yeah, very
I guess.
rare. Okay,
You could say that.
Yeah, but with somebody, you know, as we're reminiscing here, okay, and you being the great lawyer that you are, and congratulations on what you're doing. You know, you're doing a fabulous job. Tell me about what you remember and what, you know, if you learned anything from your grandfather.
Well, growing up, of course, I just remember him as my grandpa. You know, he was family first always. Anything that we were involved in as his grandchildren, and there were many of us, 9 collectively, you know, he was going to be involved with, of course. So he would be filming, you know, at his home, at our homes, holidays, random days, basketball games. You know, just last night I was watching some video of my high school and college basketball time, courtesy of my grandfather, who's been gone now since 2014. But I also learned about him as an attorney, interestingly enough, when he passed away, and when we had his viewing. And you know, those in the legal community were coming through to pay their respects. You know, then I think I developed an appreciation for you know, I previously had an appreciation for the type of man that he was. But seeing the remarks that people were making to me about him as an attorney led me to have an appreciation for who he was also as an attorney. And I think, you know, honesty and integrity, I think, certainly was, you know, pervasive in both his personal and professional life.
When you told your grandfather, Tony I'm talking about, that you were going to become an attorney, what did he say?
Now, I don't recall specifically what he said. You know, he did give me my diploma when I graduated from law school. I have a picture of that. I'll never forget that. I know he was proud.
Oh, there's no question about it.
But just being the family man that he was equally as proud of my cousins and my siblings, you know, for whatever profession that they were pursuing. And that was Tony. That was my grandfather.
He was way ahead of his time in law. I mean, because your grandfather and I were very close.
Yeah.
We spend a lot of time together, and he was just so far ahead. And he was so quiet.
Yes.
But I mean, you didn't want to mess with him, okay,
right?
When it came to law, you know. And,
yep.
And you know, so you learn some things. Connie, learning from, you know, your parents, when your father was practicing, there's so many great cases that happened, but I remember he was even appointed to be a judge. Okay.
He was by Governor Thornburg.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
to politics again, that's another story, you know. But he would have been.
That's 2 more shows.
Yeah, it was just. It was.
Yeah,
that was a disgrace.
That was quite a story.
That
yeah.
was the total disgrace. Anyway, staying on the positive, let's talk about your dad when he practiced. Some of the big cases that he had.
Well, he started out in 1953, Sam, and at that time he went in with my grandfather and my Uncle Rex at the Hazelton National Bank building. And then I think 2 years after my dad started with them, Henry Giuliani came in with them. So the 4 of them were there in the Hazelton National Bank building. And eventually my dad and Henry teamed up with Joe Ustinowski and Dick Bernstein, and they formed a law firm there, again stayed in the Hazelton National Bank. But my dad's practice first was like my grandfather's practice. It was, you know, helping the working people of the Hazelton area. You do what litigation you could, and he knew litigation because one of the things that he did early on was he clerked right after law school. He was a law clerk for a Supreme Court justice here in Pennsylvania for a couple of years, and in our business, that's a pretty high accolade because they only pick the real smart guys. My dad was very smart, but you learn the law there because they're writing the Supreme Court opinions. But when he came out, he got very involved in the community with the JCs. He was president. It was at a time when Dr. Desson and Joe Yensko were getting Can-Do up and going and on its feet, and he was with the JCs involved with fundraisers to get the first industrial park going the Belmont Industrial Park. And then later on, he became solicitor for the school district at a time when they were forming the jointure of, I think it was McAdoo, Freeland, West Hazelton, and Hazelton. I think that was around 1968, I want to say that. And then he stayed solicitor for the school district for about 13 years. But a real tragedy happened in 1969. There was a plane crash in Puerto Rico, and 4 local people were on that plane, and they were killed. And the families came to my dad to represent them. And that was a whole different ballgame, something different than I think was seen at the time here in Hazelton, because that case involved the United States government as a defendant, because it was the air traffic controllers that gave this airplane coming into the San Juan, Puerto Rico airport the wrong heading and the wrong altitude, and the pilots didn't pick it up. It was called Prinair, was the airline. I don't think they exist today. And the plane, just in some rain, a rainstorm, flew right in to what they call the El Yunque Mountain, and all 21 people aboard were killed, including 4 people from our area. And that was very involved, because when you sue the government, they don't just roll over and write you a check. They fought tooth and nail, as did the airport. And the case was split in 2, because they were not admitting fault. So the fault part of the trial was first done in New York City, and my dad was appointed by the other families and the lawyers to be lead trial counsel in federal court in New York on the fault part, or what we call the liability trial in that case. And after a week of trial, both the federal government and the airline conceded that it was their fault. They did not allow the case to go to a jury. They admitted fault. And then the court in New York moved the damage part of the case, that's the part that involves how much is to be awarded, to federal court in Puerto Rico. So you can imagine just the logistics of that.
Wow.
Just the logistics of that, because some of the air traffic controllers were scattered all over the country. Their depositions had to be taken. It was a pretty massive undertaking.
So we have about a minute left. Your involvement then, you were involved with that, right?
The latter part of that, towards the damage part of the trial, I was in law school and I became involved in the case at that point in time. And Sam, that was really the part that got me involved in injury litigation, if you will. And that has been my practice mostly from 1974 when I graduated up until now. And now Alexis is jumping in. She's
doing a good job too.
She's a pretty tough cookie. She's very competitive. She was competitive as a high school and college basketball player and as a DA, and she's competitive now.
Folks, this is part 1. The story just gets better. Now, before we we leave and come back again, in your family, how many lawyers?
Well, my grandfather, my Uncle Rex, my dad, myself, and 2 sisters, Paula and Nina. I'm the oldest of 5, and of course Alexis.
Right, and we'll talk about the interesting things about law and how it involves. But when you said, Lexi, when you're talking about roots and you're talking about people you can trust, there's a lot of times people come to you, they don't want to come to you, but they have to come to you. So sometimes you see them in the best of spirits and not so best of spirits.
Yep.
Thanks for coming on the show. I'm looking forward to part 2.
Thanks, Sam.
Remember, this Law Talk is brought to you by Falvello Law Firm at 570-788-4191. or go to their website, falvellolaw.com. All of our shows, incidentally, are on the website and YouTube. There's many shows we've done with Connie on Law Talk, a lot of great information. I'm going to get to some of those questions somewhere down the line, but I want to stay with the story of the Falvello Law Firm, 100 years. We'll see you next time.